Welcome to the next installment of our Stepping Stones series. And today we are interviewing Dr. Erin Tone. So, Erin, if you want to just introduce yourself and say a little bit about what you do your research on.
Certainly. I have been a faculty member in the department since 2005. I'm in the clinical and the cognitive and affective neuroscience programs. And my research focuses on anxiety and relationships. And I come at questions about how anxiety gets in the way of our connecting with each other from multiple directions that range from how does the brain participate to what are the things that we do when we're anxious that make it hard for us to have the relationships we want.
Okay, so generally speaking, how did you come across that idea? I mean, what made you think you wanted to go, for example, to graduate school in the first place?
So I have traveled probably one of the more winding paths of our faculty members. I was an English and German literature major in
Okay.
college and took, I think, one psychology course, two psychology courses, both of which were kind of tangential, really interesting. And then I graduated and joined Teach for America in the first year it existed
Mm.
and was sent to New Orleans to teach high school speech and drama, which I had no training in. And I landed in this wonderful school with wonderful students who were very talented. And what started to strike me was how anxious they were. And
Mm-hmm.
these brilliant kids would get up and give a speech or perform in a one-act play, return to their desk with their head on they were devastated despite the fact that all of the feedback in the room had been positive. So I
Interesting.
started wondering what is going on that they're having so much difficulty reading the cues that for an outsider are so unequivocally positive. So
Mm-hmm.
I left after a year of, I really wasn't equipped to teach speech and drama and went to graduate school in school psychology, thinking, well, maybe I can help these kids
Mm-hmm.
if I become a school psychologist. So I got a master's in school psychology, and again, kind of dumb luck, my practicum placement was at a children's psychiatric hospital, and I fell in love with that work. So I got a job there doing half-time research and half-time clinical work after I graduated and stayed there for about 2 years and realized I really wanted to get a clinical doctorate. So applied to graduate school, and the rest is history.
My goodness, my goodness. And you're now the director of clinical training
I am.
here? Okay. Well, we'll save a special question for advice for people trying to get into clinical psychology.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But first, for people who are planning to go for a PhD in psychology, particularly, what do you wish someone had told you? Is there anything that you sort of wish you'd known going into graduate school?
Yeah. So I wish I had known more about what the whole course of training looked like. I was,
Mm,
for example, kind of shocked to discover that one didn't just graduate and go on to become a professor, that typically you would, after you finished your doctorate, go on for more training at a postdoctoral fellowship. So that would have been helpful for me to have more guidance about just to plan my path. It was a longer road than I expected, and
hmm.
that turned out to be fine, but it certainly would have been easier to anticipate what my life was going to be looking like. Um, I was lucky enough to apply to a relatively small number of programs and get
Mm.
accepted. Uh, Looking back, I was just naive. I think I would have hedged my bet and applied to a lot more,
Yeah.
really carefully researched the people I was applying to work with in a way that I think I was a little bit more haphazard about than I might have been.
Interesting. Did that lead to any big challenge? What would you think your biggest challenge was in graduate school, getting through everything?
I would say self-confidence, coming from a background that
Mm.
was not a psychology major. I would drive in every morning, and I still live in the house that I lived in during graduate school. uh,
goodness.
completely renovated now, but I still remember when I drive by route past Emory, where I went to graduate school, I would talk myself through. You are not going to, everybody's going to know more than you do, and that's okay. Ask the dumb questions. And it was just kind of a mantra every morning to get myself geared up to learn what I needed to learn. And what I found was that people were grateful that I asked the dumb questions,
Yeah.
and often they weren't as dumb as I thought they were.
Yeah, it's amazing when you give it a go, and then
Yeah,
suddenly it's like, oh, that's actually a really good question. Oh, that's marvelous. I had no idea it was so challenging for you, or that you were so nervous about things
did
coming
you repeat
into
that?
coming.
My phone rang while you
Oh,
were
oh,
asking the
no,
question, and I
I
couldn't, and
just
it
said
blocked you out.
I, I had no idea that you had been that nervous going into graduate school, or that sense of not being prepared. And yet,
Absolutely.
but the goal was so important, you were willing to keep going anyway.
Yeah, and it
Marvelous.
was interesting how much better that got, and how I was glad that in retrospect, I was glad that I came in relatively unprepared because it
Mm,
forced me to really pay attention and to
okay.
absorb things
Yeah.
in a way that integrated what I'd learned in other contexts.
Mm, I can imagine. Yeah, you're sort of being very aware of having to put the effort in. You couldn't take anything for granted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. So what was something that really kept you going in either in grad school or in your early career when you were facing some of those challenges? I mean, obviously giving yourself a pep talk. Did you get any sort of support from the outside, or anything
Um,
you sort of experienced that helped you keep going?
yeah, and I consider him still my mentor. My graduate mentor was
Mm,
stunning. Very wonderful about helping me take care of myself. Uh, the only thing I ever remember getting pressure from him about was exercising. He wanted to make sure that all of his students worked out regularly. But there was he was a safe space, and I think finding somebody who you trust implicitly, whether it's your
mhm.
mentor, another faculty member, senior students, somebody else in your life who you trust to have your best interests at heart,
Yeah.
really made a difference for me.
Yeah, that is important, isn't it? You don't have to necessarily be the best of friends, but you need to trust that they have your best interests at heart. That's
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
the best description of healthy mentoring and relationship.
yeah. And I look back, I don't know what your experience was like, but I do remember all of the graduate students in my program when the time of the year rolled around, when faculty would review students, there's just this pall of paranoia would descend, and we were all convinced that they were out to get us, which now as a faculty member feels so crazy to
Why
me.
would you do that?
I
Yeah.
know we have you here because we want you,
Yeah.
but I think back on that often, that it's easy to assume that people are looking for your flaws, they're looking for
Mm.
reasons to criticize you, when really that's not the case at all.
Yeah, generally speaking, that is not the case. So, what was something that you were coming in sort of not on the same page as many of the other people in the program? What was something that everybody else seemed to be able to wrap their head around the first, in those early
Mm.
days of your career, that you really struggled with, where you were sort of like, okay, I'm not even going to ask about, because it seems like everybody else knows what's going on, and I just can't grasp it. But eventually you get to the point where you come to grips with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's an interesting question because I think I read so thoroughly and deeply and carefully out of a kind of fear that I would be falling behind, that I didn't run into much like that. Um,
Interesting.
it, it I may be the only person who read word for word every
Every
assignment my first
textbook.
couple of years of graduate school because I was so certain that everyone else had already learned things. I think maybe I struggled more with some of the psychometric
Hmm.
principles, kind of test construction and measurement. Um,
Well, like I
I
had,
think I just worked harder. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, many of us had an experience where there's, some piece of jargon that everybody just sort of tossed around in whatever lab or department you were in that was specific to whatever lab or department you were in, and you're like, I don't know what this means.
Yeah, it's funny. I've probably blocked a lot of that out. I'm sure there were many things.
Coping mechanism.
Yeah, that I did in part because I felt like I had permission coming from the outside to
Yeah.
ask about anything. That I could say, well, I'm an English major. What do I know? Uh,
Oh, that is a benefit,
so it
isn't it?
was
That's
helpful to just
yeah.
fall back on my ignorance. Well, how would I know?
Right. Oh, I didn't even think of that as being an advantage where you
It
don't
could
have
be,
to,
yeah.
yeah, where you can say, I'm sorry, that's not part of that's not my specialty,
Yeah,
not my
please
background.
educate me.
Oh, very good. Interesting. Interesting. Well, I'm glad you ended up as a clinical psychologist. So what advice would you give a student who's thinking about, maybe they're in their junior year and they're thinking about going on in clinical psychology? What would you recommend? There's so many things you have to consider, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, and so to give it, it's a highly competitive field. So as an
Mm,
example, this year we had 700 applicants for 10 slots. So I think entering the process with the idea that it's a marathon, not a sprint,
mm,
that many, many, many outstanding applicants apply more than once before they get in, and the programs turn down many more qualified people than they can accept. I think it's really important to go in knowing that because
hmm
otherwise it feels impossible. The second thing I would say is to get as much research experience as possible, and
hmm
if that's not possible, and for many people it isn't, build the kinds of skills that you need in research. Build your critical thinking skills. You might have a job working in a warehouse. Maybe you're the one who solves a problem about how to fit more in the warehouse or
Mm,
to move the process more efficiently. Being able to say you've used critical thinking, problem solving, interpersonal skills to make things better somewhere, that translates really well to clinical research. And so even if you were unable to find a research lab, you went to an undergraduate a small school where there really weren't research opportunities, there are ways to demonstrate research skills and capacities that have nothing to do with scientific study.
mm. But how important is actually working in a clinic,
I would say less important than
really?
than research. We tend, at least in our programs, different programs
Hmm
vary, to assume that we'll provide most of the clinical training. And
Okay.
we really want to make sure that you're learning the things we want you to learn. Um, and so, at least when I'm reviewing applications, I will privilege uh, an application where the student has either gained research experience or very effectively shown me that they're good thinkers and they're good problem solvers and they're intellectually curious over someone who's worked on a lot of hotlines or had a lot
Mm.
of clinical kinds of experiences.
But what about I mean, the clinical capacity, right? Or the clinical potential is a different thread of a person's character in many ways than just research per se. Speaking as someone who doesn't have that thread, I'm all about
I
the
think you
research.
undersell
I think
yourself.
I think I'm all about the research, but I don't want to do clinical practice. And so, but obviously are people who think they want to do clinical practice and then they get into it, they go through all the fuss and the muss and they get
Mhm.
into a clinical practice, a clinical program, and then they realize this is not for me. What would you recommend for people who are thinking about it, but they're like, well, all my friends say I like to help them and I like to give advice. I mean, is that enough? Or is there
Yeah,
something else?
that's a great question. I do think the people who end up in clinical often are the people who friends turn to for
Yeah.
advice, and those often are the people who gravitate toward this kind of work. Um, and so I think assessing your interpersonal skills. Are you a good listener?
Mm,
Are you someone who can sit back and not necessarily give advice, but just be with people when they're in very uncomfortable, unpleasant, emotional places? those will serve you well. Clinical psychology isn't really about telling people what to do. It's gaining comfort with people when they're in really miserable spaces, and being able to sit with them until they can get past them. So paying attention to that capacity, if that's something that really turns you off, you probably don't want to be a clinical psychologist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but interpersonal skill matters. Are you someone who can, you don't have to be outgoing and gregarious. We have lots of great
Mhm.
introverts who are clinical psychologists, but can you put other people first and be
Mm.
interested in them in a way that takes yourself as much as possible out of the room?
That's a great summary of that. Yeah,
Mm.
that's probably very helpful. I don't want to, use you as a replacement for the APA or anything like that, but it's
Right,
marvelous to get those options. So what do you think about dovetailing the clinical practice with the research career? Do you have to sort of give one up to do the other? Do you have a few hours where you can do obviously you're in a clinical supervision, clinical training, but do most
right.
clinical, I mean, before you were doing that, did you have the ability to both see patients and do research, or how did you balance that?
Yeah, so I really traveled a pretty research heavy path.
Mm,
I did a 4-year research postdoc at the National Institutes of Health that really had minimal. I worked a lot with people with anxiety, which was my
hmm
focus, but I was very rarely a therapist. Most people, and we just had a wonderful illustration of this yesterday. We had our clinical research
mm,
day, and we brought back 9 alumni who are doing all sorts of things across the country. And what was really exciting was the number of them who have these wonderful varied careers where they see clients, they teach, they do consulting work, they do research. They have found ways to build in the things that they love into their work. So it's one of the things that I like about clinical psychology is that it opens up a lot of possibilities. You can do full-time clinical
yeah.
work, full-time research, full-time consulting, or some hybrid of all three plus more.
Wow. It does make it worthwhile, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, that I think is one of the big sells and one of the reasons we get so many
Yeah,
applicants to these programs.
is that it does open a lot of doors. Now,
Yeah.
my understanding is if you go to the clinical program in a particular state, that's where you pretty much should expect to practice. Is that accurate, or are you allowed to change?
That's a great question, and you actually have a lot of flexibility.
Okay.
So you there are several stages to getting to meeting the requirements for licensure, and every state is different.
Mm,
So in Georgia, for example, where we are, you have to have a doctoral degree from an accredited program, an APA accredited program. You have to complete a year-long clinical internship uh, that is also typically at an accredited program. You then have to pass a test, which is a miserable, stupid multiple choice test. And you have to get additional postdoctoral training hours where
okay.
you either have clinical contact or the equivalent. Uh, I, at last check, it was 1,500 hours, which is usually a
My
year or two
goodness.
of work,
Yeah.
but it varies, and
And
I
that's
think that's
after the
shifting.
PhD.
Hmm.
Wow.
So it's a long process. Different states vary though. So I was first licensed in Maryland,
Mm,
where I did my postdoctoral work, and it was much less stringent.
hmm.
So you can generally, once you're licensed in one state, when you move to another state, pretty easily meet the additional requirements and
Oh,
transfer your license.
okay.
So I stayed licensed in Maryland and Georgia for a little while, and now I'm
Hmm
just licensed in Georgia. The states that are the most challenging are New York and I believe California that have additional requirements above and beyond the ones that I just described. But
Mm.
each program is now required to put on its website a list with links to all of the states' licensure requirements so that anyone coming in would know here's how this program will or won't help me meet requirements for the states where I want to live.
Oh, that's handy. Okay, so you can
Yeah.
be felt flexible that way and planning ahead. because it's a long
Absolutely.
path. It's a long path, and of course you have to dovetail if you're going to start raising a family or something like that. You want to be thinking about how you want to do that.
Definitely. And I would say a good maybe 30–40% of our students either stay in or come back to Georgia.
Mm,
The remainder go all over the country and the world. We have people scattered from Greece to
mm,
Alaska, and they each have been licensed according to the guidelines
yeah.
of the place where they are.
Fantastic. That's really marvelous. No wonder it's yeah, no wonder it's such a popular program to try to get into.
Yeah.
I think that's really marvelous. So, one last question, I think, and then we'll wrap it up. So,
Okay.
tell me, what do you enjoy the most about your research?
Oh, oh, that's a really hard one.
Ah!
I find the questions that I get to ask with students really, really engaging. And I love being in an area where I can learn from my students as much
Mm,
as they learn from me. So they come in with interests that are related to mine, but don't always fully overlap. And so right now, for example, I have students who've gotten very, very interested in anxiety about interacting with people from groups that you don't belong to. Never
mm,
been an area of focus for me, but I've learned a tremendous amount in guiding them through their research. I have other students right now who happen to both be very interested in worry and rumination.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so it's taking me in directions that fascinate me, but I might not have gone otherwise.
Yeah, there is that interplay, isn't there, between the different individuals in the lab and what questions are asked and what directions you go.
Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic. Long may it continue. Maybe solve lots of problems.
I know, and I get to work with great people like you. So it's
It's a fun set of collaborations. So that's
yeah.
marvelous. Well, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you'd like to add? Any last piece of advice to people who are considering graduate school in psychology?
Yeah, I do want to repeat the importance of persistence. So
Mm,
many fabulous uh, clinical psychologists did not get in their first or even their second try. If this is really what you want to do, know that it can be a long road, but that does not necessarily say anything about you. Certainly seek feedback from the people who know you well. The programs you apply to aren't necessarily going to be able to give you feedback about why you didn't get in, but really get the people who know you well to help you assess your strengths and weaknesses so that you can continually build a stronger application.
marvelous. Words to go by. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.